A Miss Marple Mystery, Chapter 1. An Invitation to Tea. The village of Little Wyvern lay so quietly beneath its September sky that one might have believed nothing had ever happened there at all, and nothing ever would. It was the kind of afternoon that seemed borrowed from an older, gentler England, the light falling amber and unhurried across the thatched roofs, the church bell marking the hour with the patient indifference of something that had marked 10,000 hours before it, and would mark 10,000 more, quite unmoved by whatever small human dramas unfolded beneath its bronze voice. Miss Jane Marple, arriving by the afternoon train and walking the last half-mile along the lane, out of preference rather than necessity, thought, not for the first time, that villages such as this one wore their peace like a very good coat, beautifully cut, entirely convincing, and concealing, more often than not, a great deal underneath. She had come to Little Wyvern to visit her old friend Dolly Bantry's cousin, a mild widow named Mrs. Featherstone, who kept bees and complained gently of her rheumatism, and she had certainly not come with any thought of murder. And yet, as she would say afterward, with the particular dryness she reserved for such observations, one rarely does. It was Mrs. Featherstone who mentioned, over a breakfast of good strong tea and rather too much marmalade, that they had both been invited to Lady Constance Ashworth's Thursday gathering at the Manor. "You must come, Jane," she said, buttering her toast with the brisk satisfaction of a woman delivering good news. "Everyone who is anyone in Little Wyvern goes to Constance's Thursdays. It is rather like church, except one is expected to say a good deal less about one's soul and a good deal more about one's garden." Miss Marple accepted, as she generally did, with an expression of placid interest that concealed a mind already quietly at work. She had heard of Lady Constance Ashworth before. One heard of such women, in villages of a certain size, the way one heard of the weather, inevitably, and usually with a faint note of resignation. Ashworth Manor, when they arrived that afternoon, proved to be exactly as grand and exactly as cold as its reputation suggested. A handsome grey house set behind clipped yews so precise they might have been cut with a razor rather than shears, its windows catching the low autumn sun in a way that made the whole facade seem, for a moment, to be watching them approach. The drawing-room, when they were shown into it, was a masterpiece of controlled elegance. Silver gleaming, china arranged with mathematical exactness, and at its centre, presiding over the tea-table like a small, immaculate monarch, sat Lady Constance herself. She was a striking woman still, despite her 68 years, upright, sharp-eyed, her silver hair arranged with military precision, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had never once, in her entire life, been made to wait for anything she wanted. She greeted her guests with a warmth that Miss Marple noted, with quiet interest, seemed to increase or diminish according to some private calculation of each visitor's usefulness. The gathering assembled itself around the table with the unhurried choreography of long habit. There was Gerald Ashworth, Constance's nephew, handsome and restless, whose smile came a fraction too quickly, and whose eyes, when he thought no one observed him, drifted again and again to the ormolu clock upon the mantel, as though counting down toward some private deadline. There was Dr. Henry Pell, greying and courteous, who addressed Lady Constance with the careful, overcorrect manner of a man handling something that had once burned him. There was Mrs. Vera Latimer, the vicar's wife, whose laughter arrived a half-second late to every remark, as though she were perpetually listening for something beneath the conversation rather than to it. And moving among them all, silent and precise as a shadow given purpose, was Eleanor Prynne, Lady Constance's companion. Miss Marple found her gaze returning to Eleanor more than once. There was nothing remarkable in her appearance. A woman of perhaps 60, grey-clad, unobtrusive, the sort of person one's eye might slide past a dozen times in an afternoon without truly seeing. And yet she poured the tea with a particular, practiced grace, moving from cup to cup with the ease of long ritual, and when Lady Constance addressed her, "Eleanor, the lapsang, if you please, and do try not to let it stew as you did last week," the words were delivered with a small, casual cruelty that seemed to land upon Eleanor's composed face and simply vanish, absorbed, as water is absorbed into very old stone. The conversation drifted on in its accustomed channels: the fete, the weather, a mild scandal involving the new curate, while the afternoon light softened toward gold beyond the long windows. Miss Marple, listening with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning that the truest things are said sideways, found herself watching the tea things instead. The careful pour, the exact placement of each cup, Eleanor's steady hand. It was Lady Constance who broke the small, comfortable silence, raising her cup with a faint, satisfied smile, mid-sentence. "As I was saying, one really cannot trust the young to understand the value of—" She did not finish. The cup slipped from her fingers with a sound too soft for what followed, a strange, arrested stillness crossing her face, as though she had just recalled, too late, something of great importance. And then Lady Constance Ashworth fell forward across her own beautifully appointed table, while her teacup, still nearly full, rolled in a slow, deliberate arc across the pale Persian rug, and came to rest, undisturbed and gently steaming, at Miss Marple's feet. Chapter 2. The Room Remembers. There is a particular silence that falls over a house after death has entered it uninvited. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty room, but something denser, more attentive, as though the walls themselves have drawn a single sharp breath and are holding it still. Miss Marple had known that silence before, in other houses, in other villages, and she recognized it now in the drawing-room of Ashworth Manor, as Dr. Pell rose at last from his kneeling position beside Lady Constance's chair, drew off his spectacles, and said, in the flat, careful voice of a man delivering news he does not yet fully believe himself, that this had not been a seizure of the heart. "Poison," he said, and then, as though the word required some softening, added, "I should think, from the smell of the cup, and forgive me, it is not a pleasant thing to say of a woman I have known 30 years. Something quick. Cyanide, perhaps, though I shall not swear to it until a proper analysis is done." No one in the room moved for a long moment. Gerald had gone very white and very still, his hand frozen halfway to the mantel clock he had been watching so persistently not 10 minutes before. Vera Latimer had begun, quietly and without apparent awareness of doing so, to twist her wedding ring round and round upon her finger, while her husband's absence from the gathering seemed suddenly, to Miss Marple's practised eye, a small and curious fact worth remembering. And Eleanor Prynne stood exactly where she had stood when the cup fell, near the tea-table, her hands folded before her, her face composed into an expression of correct and decorous grief that struck Miss Marple, watching her closely across the ruin of the afternoon, as being very slightly too correct, as a coat is sometimes cut a fraction too well to have been made for the body wearing it. It was perhaps 40 minutes later that Inspector Craddock arrived from the county station, brisk, capable, and entirely modern in his methods, the sort of young man, Miss Marple reflected, who trusted fingerprints and timetables with the same uncomplicated faith that his grandmother's generation had trusted the Almighty, and who regarded elderly ladies with knitting bags as, at best, a mild inconvenience to be managed with courtesy, and at worst, an obstruction to proper procedure. He moved through the drawing-room with brisk efficiency, directing the removal of the body, the sealing of the tea-things, the careful bagging of each cup and saucer, and it was several minutes before he seemed to notice Miss Marple at all, seated quietly in the window-seat, with her hands folded over her handbag, observing the room with an attention that might, to an untrained eye, have been mistaken for simple bewilderment. "You were a guest, I understand," he said, not unkindly, but with the particular briskness of a man working through a list. "Miss Marple, is it? I shall need a statement, of course, though I don't suppose you saw a great deal from over here." "No," Miss Marple agreed placidly. "I don't suppose I did, Inspector, though I did notice one or two rather curious things about the tea." Craddock's expression suggested that he considered curious things about tea to be, on the whole, rather beneath the dignity of a murder investigation, and he moved on to more promising witnesses with the faint, courteous impatience of a man who has already decided where the truth is likely to be found, and does not expect an old woman in a window-seat to have located it first. Miss Marple did not mind this in the least. She had, in fact, come to rather prefer it. While the inspector busied himself with fingerprint powder and measured questions about who had stood where and at what hour, Miss Marple remained in her window-seat and did what she had always done best, in Little Wyvern as in St. Mary Mead. In every drawing-room and vicarage garden and village hall she had ever sat quietly within, she watched. Not the obvious things, not the overturned cup, nor the pale waxen stillness of the room's absent centre, but the smaller, truer things, the way Eleanor Prynne's hands, though folded with perfect composure, had gone very slightly white at the knuckle, as though gripping something that was not there. The way Gerald kept glancing toward the door, not with grief, but with something closer to calculation, as a man might glance toward an exit. The way Dr. Pell, for all his professional steadiness, could not quite bring himself to look directly at the chair where Lady Constance had died, but addressed his remarks instead to a point somewhere just above it, as one might avoid looking at an old wound. And she watched, above all, the tea-table itself, now dusted and photographed and catalogued by the inspector's men, and found herself thinking not of the poison, which was, after all, a chemist's puzzle and none of hers to solve, but of the ritual that had surrounded it. 6 people, seated in the same chairs they had occupied, she gathered, for years. One woman pouring, with a precision that spoke of long practice rather than mere obligation, and a silver teapot that had been filled and refilled from the same kettle, poured into the same 6 cups, and had killed only one of the 6 people who drank from it. That, Miss Marple thought, watching the pale afternoon light move slowly across the abandoned tea-things, was really rather interesting. It was nearly 6 o'clock, and the last of the official business had drawn itself away into the hall in a murmur of low voices, when Miss Marple rose from her window seat, unhurried, unremarkable, the very picture of a harmless elderly guest waiting patiently to be released, and made her way, as though by accident, toward the small door that led down to the kitchen passage. There she found the housemaid, a round-faced, frightened girl of perhaps 19, named Polly, sitting on an upturned crate, with her apron pressed to her eyes, weeping with the particular abandon of the very young confronting death for the first time. Miss Marple sat down beside her, with no great ceremony, and waited, for she had long ago learned that grief, like a shy animal, will often approach on its own if one simply keeps still and does not reach for it. Until Polly's sobs had softened into hiccuping breaths, and the girl looked up at her with the dazed gratitude of someone unexpectedly offered kindness in the midst of chaos. There, Miss Marple said gently. It has been a dreadful shock for everyone, I'm sure. And worse for you, I should think, having to serve in a house where such a thing has happened. She paused, folding her gloved hands with an air of mild, grandmotherly interest, and asked, as though the thought had only just occurred to her, "Tell me, my dear, was it always Miss Prynne who poured the tea? I noticed she seemed very practiced at it." It was a small question, offered so lightly it might almost have passed unnoticed. But Polly's face, still blotched with crying, went suddenly, curiously still, and for a moment she did not answer at all, but glanced instead toward the closed kitchen door, as though checking that no one stood behind it, before she said, in a voice dropped almost to a whisper, "Always, miss. Every Thursday, 8 years now, and never once let anyone else near the pot. Not me, not cook, not even her ladyship herself. Not since the very first week Miss Prynne come to the house." She hesitated again, twisting the corner of her apron between her fingers, and added, with the particular unease of a servant confessing something she has never quite allowed herself to think clearly before, "Her ladyship used to laugh about it, miss. Said Miss Prynne poured tea like it was a sacred duty, her ladyship said. Only I never thought it were funny, not really. I always thought there was something a bit odd about it, miss, though I couldn't rightly say what." The kitchen clock ticked on into the gathering dusk, and somewhere above them, in the sealed and silent drawing-room, the last pale light was fading from the window where a teacup had once rolled to a stop at an old woman's feet, while Miss Marple sat very still beside the weeping housemaid, and felt, with the quiet, certain instinct of long experience, that she had just been handed the first true thread of something far older and far sadder than a simple poisoning. Chapter 3. 6 Cups, 6 Secrets. The morning room at Ashworth Manor had been given over, by Inspector Craddock's brisk instruction, to the business of formal interviews, and there was something faintly absurd, Miss Marple thought, in the way that room in particular had been chosen for it. For it was a bright, cheerful chamber, papered in pale yellow, hung with watercolours of hunting scenes, and entirely unsuited to the grim purpose now being conducted within its walls. She had secured her own place there, not by any authority, but by the simple, time-tested method available to elderly women of her sort. She had asked, mildly, whether she might sit quietly in the corner with her knitting, as the whole dreadful business had left her feeling quite unequal to the walk home just yet. And no one, least of all Inspector Craddock, who had already begun to regard her as a fixture of the furniture rather than a witness of consequence, had thought to object. Gerald Ashworth came first, and came badly. He arranged himself in the chair opposite Craddock, with the studied carelessness of a young man trying very hard to appear untroubled, one leg crossed over the other, his fingers drumming a small, restless rhythm against his knee that he seemed entirely unaware of. His account of his aunt's death was appropriately shocked, appropriately grieved, and yet Miss Marple, counting stitches in the corner with every appearance of complete absorption, noted that his grief arrived a beat too late behind his words, as an actor sometimes remembers his emotion only after he has already spoken his line. When Craddock asked, almost as an afterthought, whether Gerald had been in any particular financial difficulty of late, the young man's composure slipped for just an instant, a flicker, quickly suppressed, of something that was not quite fear and not quite calculation, but lay uncomfortably near to both, before he answered, with rather too much lightness, that a man of his age was always a little pressed, wasn't he? Nothing out of the ordinary. Miss Marple, without lifting her eyes from her knitting, thought that this was very probably a lie, though not, she suspected, the lie that mattered most this morning. Dr. Pell came next, composed and courteous, offering his professional assessment of the poison's likely nature with the careful precision of a man on familiar ground. But when Craddock, consulting his notes, asked how long the doctor had known Lady Constance, something crossed his face, brief, involuntary, gone almost before it had fully formed, that Miss Marple recognized at once, for she had seen that particular expression on other faces, in other rooms, across a lifetime of village gatherings, the look of a man revisiting, quite against his will, a wound he had believed long healed. "A great many years," he said, and his voice, though steady, had gone very slightly careful, the way a man's voice goes careful when he is choosing each word, as one chooses a stepping stone across a stream whose depth he does not wish to reveal. He did not elaborate, and Craddock, satisfied with the surface of the answer, did not press him. But Miss Marple, watching the doctor's hands as he spoke, observed that they had gone very still indeed, folded upon his knee, with the deliberate stillness of hands that wish very much to do something else. Mrs. Vera Latimer arrived last among the morning's witnesses, and arrived, Miss Marple thought, like a woman walking into a room she has been dreading for a very long time. She was pale beneath her careful application of powder, and her laughter, that curious, half-second delayed laughter Miss Marple had noted at the tea-table, was entirely absent now, replaced by a kind of brittle, over-explained politeness that seemed to reach for every question and answer it 3 times over, as though the truth, once let loose, might run somewhere she could not follow it. When Craddock asked, gently enough, whether she had noticed anything unusual about Lady Constance's manner in recent weeks, Mrs. Latimer's hand went, quite unconsciously, to the small gold cross at her throat, and she said, far too quickly, that Constance had always been exactly herself, always, in every particular, a denial so emphatic, so entirely unprompted by the mild nature of the question, that Miss Marple set down a stitch and did not immediately pick it up again. It was in the quiet interval between witnesses, while Craddock's constable went to fetch old Tomkins from the garden, that Miss Marple rose from her corner chair, murmured something about the closeness of the room, and made her way, with the unhurried aimlessness of an old woman simply wanting air, toward the drawing-room where the tragedy itself had unfolded, now sealed with police tape, but not, she noted, the hearth, which the young constable on duty had evidently judged of no evidential interest whatsoever, and left entirely unguarded. The grate was cold and largely empty, as one would expect of a September fire lit more for cheer than necessity, and long since burned to ash. But there, caught against the fire-iron where the draught had evidently pushed it rather than allowed it to burn entire, lay a curl of blackened paper, no larger than a visiting card, its edges crumbled to soft grey lace, its centre, where the fire had not quite reached before dying, still faintly, stubbornly legible. Miss Marple knelt, with the careful, unhurried economy of movement of a woman who has kneeled in a great many gardens and does not intend to injure herself doing so now, and lifted the fragment between two fingers with the delicacy of someone handling a moth's wing. The hand that had written it was firm, educated, entirely unlike the looping, old-fashioned script she had glimpsed on Lady Constance's engagement cards in the hall, and the words that remained, broken and incomplete as they were, arranged themselves before her eyes with a clarity that seemed, for a moment, to still the ordinary sounds of the house around her entirely. 8 years of silence is surely payment enough, and I will not be spoken to as though I were. The annuity you propose is an insult dressed as kindness, and you know it to be so, just as you have always. The rest was ash. Miss Marple remained kneeling before the cold grate for a long moment, the fragile paper resting light as breath upon her palm, and felt the small, cold certainty settle over her that she had been looking, this entire morning, at exactly the wrong 6 cups of tea. For whatever grief, whatever fear, whatever old and ordinary human weakness lay behind Gerald's drumming fingers, or Dr. Pell's careful stillness, or Vera Latimer's too quick denials, none of it carried the particular, controlled fury of these few burnt words, written by a hand that had chosen every syllable with the precision of someone who had rehearsed them, perhaps for years, before ever committing them to paper, and had then, for reasons Miss Marple could not yet name, thought better of sending them at all, and tried, not quite successfully, to make them disappear. She was still kneeling there, the fragment held carefully between 2 gloved fingers, when she became aware of a shadow falling across the doorway behind her, and, turning, found Eleanor Prynne standing quite still upon the threshold, watching her with an expression Miss Marple would spend a good deal of the following night trying, and failing, to properly name. Chapter 4. The Companion's Silence. I did not mean to startle you, Miss Marple. Eleanor's voice, when it came, was low and even, entirely without alarm, and it was precisely that evenness, Miss Marple thought, rising from the cold hearth with the small, unhurried dignity of a woman who has been discovered doing something perfectly innocent and sees no reason to explain herself, that struck her as curious. A servant discovered, kneeling at a murdered woman's grate by a guest of the house, might reasonably have shown some flicker of surprise, some instinct toward apology or explanation. Eleanor showed neither. She simply stood in the doorway, her hands folded before her in that same composed, deliberate posture Miss Marple had noticed at the tea table, and waited, with the patient, watchful stillness of someone accustomed to being observed and long practiced in giving nothing away by it. "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly, tucking the small blackened fragment into her sleeve with a motion so unhurried and so entirely without furtiveness that it drew no particular attention to itself at all. "I was only admiring the hearth. Such beautiful old brickwork. One sees so little of it done properly nowadays." She smiled, the mild, faintly foolish smile of an elderly woman easily distracted by architectural detail, and Eleanor's expression, watching her, did not change in the slightest, though something behind her eyes, Miss Marple thought, seemed for a moment to weigh the smile very carefully indeed, as one weighs a coin one suspects, without quite being able to prove, of being counterfeit. It was Inspector Craddock, arriving a moment later with his notebook and his brisk, procedural courtesy, who formally requested Eleanor's presence in the morning room, and Miss Marple, murmuring something about fetching her wool from the window seat, contrived to follow at a distance, close enough to hear and to watch, without appearing to do either. Eleanor answered the inspector's questions with a precision that struck Miss Marple, listening from her corner with her needles moving in placid, automatic rhythm as being subtly, almost imperceptibly wrong. Not wrong in its facts, which seemed accurate in every particular, but wrong in its temperature. She described 8 years in Lady Constance's employ with the fluent, unhesitating detail of someone reciting a well-rehearsed history rather than remembering a lived one, the exact date of her arrival, the precise terms of her original engagement, the small domestic rituals of the household laid out with an accountant's thoroughness. And yet when Craddock asked, in the ordinary course of his questioning, whether she had found Lady Constance a difficult employer, Eleanor paused, not long, no longer than a breath, before answering, with careful neutrality, that Lady Constance had been exacting, and that she, Eleanor, had always endeavoured to give satisfaction. It was, Miss Marple reflected, watching the play of afternoon light across Eleanor's composed, unremarkable face. A curious way to speak of a woman one had served, and quite possibly loved, and had certainly just watched die at one's own table. There was no warmth in it, but neither, and this was the detail that caught at Miss Marple's attention like a snag thread, was there any resentment. It was the language of a stranger describing another stranger, offered with the careful, studied distance of someone who has spent a very long time deciding, in advance, exactly how much of herself she is willing to let show. "You poured the tea yourself, I understand," Craddock said, consulting his notes. "Every week?" "Every week, Inspector. It was my particular office in the household." A small, precise smile, gone as quickly as it came. "Lady Constance preferred it that way. She said I had a steadier hand than the girls." "And yesterday, nothing unusual in the pouring? No moment when the pot was left unattended, even briefly?" "No, Inspector. I poured every cup myself, as I always do." A pause, so slight that Miss Marple, had she not been listening with the particular sharpened attention she reserved for such moments, might almost have missed it, "as I always have." Craddock, satisfied, moved on to the ordering of the guests' arrival, the timing of the afternoon, the small mechanical details that formed the scaffolding of his investigation, and did not appear to notice, as Miss Marple did, the faint, private weight that had settled into Eleanor's final words, as though she were speaking not merely of a single afternoon's ritual, but of something stretching back a great deal further than 8 years, and reaching, perhaps, towards some private reckoning she alone understood. The interview concluded not long after, with nothing in its content that Craddock would think worth underlining in his notebook. A loyal companion, precise in her duties, appropriately grieved, entirely unremarkable, and Eleanor rose to leave the morning room with the same quiet composure with which she had entered it. But it was in the doorway, in the single unguarded moment before she stepped through into the hall beyond, that Miss Marple, watching from her corner, with her knitting forgotten entirely in her lap, saw something that the inspector, absorbed in his notes, did not. Eleanor paused. It was the smallest of hesitations, no more than half a second, the sort of pause that might, in any other woman, have signified nothing at all beyond simple tiredness, or the ordinary reluctance of stepping back out into a house so recently, so violently altered. But there was something in the particular quality of that pause that arrested Miss Marple's attention entirely. The way Eleanor's eyes moved, briefly and almost involuntarily, across the width of the doorframe, the worn brass of the hinge, the faded patch upon the wallpaper just beside it, where some portrait or mirror had evidently hung and been removed long ago, the way her shoulders settled. For that one unguarded instant, not with the careful deference of a woman crossing a threshold she had crossed 1,000 times as an employee, but with something older, something that belonged, Miss Marple thought with a small, cold prickle of recognition along her spine, to the particular ease of a person standing in a doorway that had been, once, quite simply, hers. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared. Eleanor stepped through into the hall, her composure entirely restored, her bearing once more that of the quiet, unremarkable companion the household had known for 8 patient years. And Miss Marple sat very still in her corner of the morning room, her knitting entirely forgotten, turning the small, strange moment over and over in her mind, with the same careful attention she might have given to a single loose thread, found, quite unexpectedly, in an otherwise seamless piece of cloth. She had seen that particular ease before, in other houses, on other faces, the unconscious, bone-deep familiarity of someone returning, however disguised, however long delayed, to a place that had once, in some essential and unrepeatable way, belonged to them. Servants did not stand in doorways like that. Guests did not. Only, Miss Marple thought, with a quiet and deepening unease that she did not yet have words enough to name, only those who have once had every right in the world to stand there, and have since, for reasons yet unknown to her, been made to forget it. Chapter 5. Old Photographs, Older Wounds. The little Wyvern Parish archive occupied a single low-ceilinged room above the village hall, reached by a narrow staircase that smelled of dust and beeswax, and the particular, faintly sweet decay of old paper, and it was here, on the morning following Eleanor's interview, that Miss Marple presented herself to Miss Agatha Wren, the parish's elderly and devoted record-keeper, with a request so mild and so plausibly harmless that it drew no suspicion whatsoever. She wondered, she explained, settling herself into a hard wooden chair with the placid patience of a woman who has nowhere else particularly urgent to be, whether the old Fate Committee photographs might still be kept somewhere about the place. She had heard the Ashworth family had always been such generous patrons of the summer fete, and she did so love looking at old village photographs. Didn't Miss Wren find them rather touching? Miss Wren, who had spent 30 years cataloguing a village's small triumphs and smaller scandals, with a devotion that had long since curdled into a genuine and occasionally alarming appetite for gossip, needed no further encouragement. Within the half hour, Miss Marple found herself seated before a stack of leather-bound albums, their pages brittle and faintly yellowed, each one a patient record of 40 summers' worth of fetes and flower shows and church bazaars, rows of smiling villagers in their Sunday best. Ranged before striped tents and trestle tables, the Ashworth family invariably prominent among them, for it had always been, Miss Wren remarked, with the satisfaction of a woman imparting well-worn local wisdom, the family's particular pride to be seen supporting such occasions. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, her attention moving with unhurried thoroughness across 3 decades of village history, until she reached the album marked, in Miss Wren's careful copperplate, with a date some 30 years past, and there, among the rows of parasols and cricket whites, she found what some quiet, patient instinct had led her, without quite knowing why, to look for. It was a small photograph, slightly faded, tucked near the bottom of a page otherwise devoted to the judging of the vegetable marrow competition. A young woman of perhaps 18 or 19, standing a little apart from the main gathering, near the edge of the frame, as though she had been caught in the picture rather than deliberately included in it. She wore a plain summer dress, unremarkable in every particular of fashion, and yet there was something in her bearing, a certain composed stillness, a way of holding the chin very slightly lifted, as though bracing against some private weight, that caught at Miss Marple's attention with the sharp, wordless insistence of a bell rung in another room. Beneath the photograph, in Miss Wren's small, careful hand, ran a caption identifying the year's Fate Committee members by name, and there, third from the left, was written a name Miss Marple did not recognize at all. Miss H. Fanshawe, companion to the family. Fanshawe, Miss Marple repeated aloud, with the mild, unhurried curiosity of a woman merely making conversation. I don't believe I know that name in the village, Miss Wren. Was she a relation of someone here? Miss Wren's face, bent close over the album beside her, took on the particular pleasure of a woman about to deliver a piece of information she had been waiting a very long time for someone to ask after. Oh, that would have been old Lord Ashworth's household, my dear. Before your time here, of course, and rather before mine too, if I'm honest, though one hears things. She was some sort of companion or governess, I believe, brought in for a season or two, and then gone as quickly as she'd come. No one quite remembers why, though there was talk, as there always is. She lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the low, dusty room to overhear. Some said she was sent away in disgrace. Others said it was Lady Constance's doing entirely, jealous of the attention old Lord Ashworth paid the girl, though whether that attention was fatherly or otherwise, I couldn't say, and wouldn't like to guess. It was all very hushed up. You know how these old families are, Miss Marple. Everything smoothed over, and nothing ever quite explained. Miss Marple sat very still, looking down at the small, faded photograph, at the young woman standing slightly apart from the gathered crowd, with her chin lifted against some weight the camera could not name, and felt the peculiar, prickling certainty settle over her that she was looking at something considerably more significant than a footnote to village history. It was, as it happened, later that same afternoon, while Miss Marple walked back through the village, with the photograph's borrowed image still turning quietly over in her mind, that she encountered Inspector Craddock emerging from the police house with the brisk, satisfied bearing of a man whose morning's work had gone considerably better than he had any right to expect. He was pleased, he informed her without being asked, to report that matters had progressed rather decisively. A search of Gerald Ashworth's rooms had turned up a money-lender's letter of considerable urgency, dated barely a fortnight before Lady Constance's death, together with certain financial papers suggesting the young man had grown desperate indeed regarding his aunt's continued reluctance to settle his debts. "Motive, opportunity, and now this," Craddock said, with the particular satisfaction of a man closing a case rather earlier than he had feared he might. "I shouldn't wonder if we have our man, Miss Marple, whatever curious things you may have noticed about the tea." Miss Marple offered the inspector her most placid and encouraging smile, murmured that she was very glad to hear matters were progressing so well, and continued on her way toward Mrs. Featherstone's cottage, with the small photograph still folded carefully inside her glove, for she had found, across a long lifetime of observing human nature in villages very much like this one, that it was rarely wise to argue with a young man's certainty when a little patience would serve the truth rather better. That evening, seated by the fire with her knitting forgotten once more in her lap and the borrowed photograph propped against the base of the lamp before her, Miss Marple found herself returning, again and again, to that small lifted chin, that particular composed stillness in a face caught unwilling at the edge of a crowded photograph 30 years gone, and it was only as the fire burned low, and the last of the evening's ordinary village sounds faded into the deeper quiet of the lane outside, that the recollection she had been circling all day arrived at last, complete and entirely unwelcome, with the quiet, devastating clarity of a door swinging open upon a room one had not meant to enter. She had seen that exact tilt of the chin only the day before, in the doorway of the morning room at Ashworth Manor, on the face of a woman the household had known, for 8 quiet and unremarkable years, as nothing more than Lady Constance's companion. Chapter 6. The Weight of Debt. Gerald Ashworth was arrested on a grey, ordinary Tuesday morning, with none of the drama such an event might have carried in a novel. No handcuffs displayed for effect, no crowd gathered to witness it, only a police motorcar drawn up quietly outside the manor's side entrance, and a young man led out to it with his collar turned up against a fine autumn drizzle, his face set in the particular blank composure of someone who has not yet allowed himself to feel the full weight of what is happening to him. By that same afternoon, the news had travelled the length of Little Wyvern, with the swift, thorough efficiency such news always travels in villages of its size, gathering embellishment as it went, until the greengrocer's boy could be heard informing a customer, with great authority, that Gerald had confessed everything, weeping the moment the handcuffs touched his wrists, a detail, Miss Marple reflected, hearing it repeated at the post office, that had certainly not occurred, and probably owed rather more to the boy's imagination than to any fact in Inspector Craddock's possession. There was, in the days that followed, a curious and rather unattractive relief that settled over the village. The relief of people who have been made uneasy by the nearness of violence, and are only too glad to have it packaged, named, and led away in a police motor car, so that ordinary life might resume its accustomed shape. Mrs. Featherstone remarked over breakfast that she had always thought there was something not quite right about young Gerald. Hadn't she said so? And Miss Marple, buttering her toast with every appearance of placid agreement, thought privately that Mrs. Featherstone had said nothing of the kind until that very morning, and that this, too, was a very ordinary and very human thing for a frightened village to do. But Miss Marple herself did not share in the relief. It was not that she doubted Gerald's debts, nor his desperation, nor even his capacity for a certain reckless selfishness that might, under sufficiently desperate circumstances, curdle into something worse. It was, rather, a matter of method, and here her mind returned, again and again, with the patient, worrying persistence of a tongue returning to a sore tooth, to the particular character of the crime itself. A man drowning in debt, cornered and desperate, might strike out in panic, might act in haste with whatever poison came most readily to hand, leaving behind the clumsy, frightened traces of an amateur. But this, the precise dosage, delivered without disturbance to 5 other cups poured from the very same pot, administered in a manner that had left no trace upon the china save what the poison itself had carried. This spoke of someone who had known, with an intimacy that could only have come from long and careful observation, exactly how Lady Constance took her tea, exactly which cup was hers, exactly how much time would pass before the poison's effect declared itself, and exactly how to ensure that effect touched no one else at that crowded table. That was not the work of panic. That was the work, Miss Marple thought, setting down her needles with unusual stillness, of someone who had rehearsed the moment, perhaps for years, perhaps without ever quite admitting to herself that she was rehearsing it at all, until the doing of it had become, in some terrible sense, simply the completion of a ritual long since begun. It was this thought, more than any evidence she could yet properly name, that carried Miss Marple on a quiet errand 2 mornings later to the offices of Mr. Simmons, the family's elderly solicitor, whose chambers occupied a narrow, book-lined room above the bank in the neighbouring market town, and who received her with the particular wary courtesy of a professional man uncertain how much an elderly lady visiting on no clear business ought properly to be told. "A dreadful business," he said, settling behind his desk with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 40 years' discretion behind it. "Dreadful. Though I understand the police have their man now, which is some small mercy, I suppose." "I understand they believe so," Miss Marple said mildly, seating herself opposite him with her handbag folded upon her knee. "Though I find myself curious, Mr. Simmons, about a small practical matter. I hope you won't think it impertinent of me to ask. I understand Lady Constance had a new will drawn up, ready to be signed." Something flickered, briefly, across the old solicitor's careful face. The particular discomfort, Miss Marple recognized, of a man whose professional discretion has just collided with a question he does not immediately know how to deflect. That is, yes, he admitted, after a moment. She was to have signed it this coming Monday, as it happens. A rather sad irony, given events. And might I ask, Miss Marple continued, with the same mild, unhurried persistence she might have used inquiring after the health of an acquaintance's aunt, what changes the new will proposed to make? I don't ask from idle curiosity, Mr. Simmons, though I quite understand if you feel unable to say. Mr. Simmons hesitated, turning his fountain pen slowly between his fingers in the manner of a man weighing discretion against some obscure sense that the small, watchful woman before him already knew rather more than she was letting on, and might, in fact, be owed an honest answer for reasons he could not entirely articulate. The changes were not extensive, he said carefully, at last. Gerald's allowance was to be somewhat reduced, pending better conduct regarding his debts. Nothing unusual there. Lady Constance had threatened as much before. A small bequest to the church roof fund. And he paused again, and this time the pause stretched rather longer than professional discretion alone seemed to require. And, Miss Marple prompted gently. And a provision, Mr. Simmons said, with evident reluctance, establishing a modest annuity for Miss Prynne, her companion. In recognition, the wording states, of long and faithful service. He set down his pen and regarded Miss Marple with an expression that had, quite suddenly, lost its earlier caution and taken on something closer to genuine unease. It struck me as odd at the time, I confess, though it was not my place to remark upon it. Lady Constance was not, as a rule, a generous woman, certainly not toward those in her employ, and yet she was most particular about the wording of that clause, insisted upon it herself, word for word, though I had offered rather warmer language. Warmer language, Miss Marple repeated softly, and something in her tone made the old solicitor look up sharply. She struck it out, he said. I had written something to the effect of gratitude for years of devoted companionship, the ordinary sort of phrase one uses. Lady Constance crossed it through with her own pen and replaced it, quite deliberately, with services rendered. I remember thinking it a rather cold way to describe 8 years of a woman's life, but then he spread his hands, the gesture of a man who has long since stopped expecting his client's private cruelties to make sense to him. It was her will and her money, and not mine to question. Miss Marple sat very still in the narrow, book-lined office, the autumn light falling grey and even through the window behind Mr. Simmons's desk, and felt the small, cold pieces of the last several days arrange themselves with quiet and terrible precision into a shape she had been circling without quite naming it since the moment she had first seen a young woman's lifted chin in a 30-year-old photograph. "Tell me, Mr. Simmons," she said, very quietly, "what did the old will say before this new one was drawn up? What provision, if any, did Lady Constance make for Miss Prynne under the terms that were in force at the moment of her death?" The solicitor did not answer at once. He looked down at his hands and then at the closed door of his own office, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur, as though the words themselves were reluctant to be given air. "That," he said slowly, "is rather a curious thing for you to ask, Miss Marple, because under the old will, the will that was valid at the hour Lady Constance died, Miss Prynne is named for nothing at all. Not a shilling. Not a single mention. As though, so far as that document was concerned, the woman had never existed in this house at all. Chapter 7. What the Garden Knows. The Ashworth Rose Garden, in the pale gold light of a late September morning, had about it the particular melancholy of a thing maintained, long after the joy that once justified it has faded. Beds still weeded, with meticulous care, standards still pruned into their correct and formal shapes, and yet somehow, for all that discipline, wearing the air of a room kept dusted for a guest who has long since stopped coming. Miss Marple found old Tomkins there, as she had rather hoped she might, kneeling before a bed of late-blooming damasks with the slow, careful reverence of a man attending something considerably more important to him than mere horticulture, and she made her approach with the unhurried, apologetic manner of an old woman who has simply wandered too far from the house and would be very glad of a moment's rest upon the garden bench, if he didn't mind the company. He did not mind it. Indeed, Miss Marple thought, watching him ease himself down onto the low stone wall beside her with the careful stiffness of a man whose joints had given 40 years' service to gardens not his own. He seemed almost grateful for it, for there was a particular loneliness, she had long observed, in servants dismissed unjustly from houses they had served with genuine devotion, a loneliness made worse rather than better by the village's ready assumption that his bitterness must surely have curdled, by now, into something darker. "They think I did it, some of them," Tomkins said, without preamble, turning a handful of damp soil slowly between his fingers. "On account of her ladyship letting me go last month, over nothing more than a broken cold frame that weren't even my doing. 41 years I served this garden, Miss Marple, man and boy, and dismissed inside a fortnight like I were nothing at all." He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge of grievance and taken on something quieter, sadder. "But I never wished her dead. I wished she'd remembered, that's all. 41 years is a long time to be forgotten." Miss Marple, who understood a great deal about the particular grief of long service unrecognized, said nothing for a moment, only allowing the old man's words to settle into the quiet garden air between them, before she asked, gently, whether he had always worked for the Ashworth family, or whether he had come to them, as she understood so many had, somewhat later in life. "Under old Lord Ashworth first," Tomkins said, "before Lady Constance's time as mistress here at all. I was under gardener then, hardly more than a boy myself." He paused, and something shifted in his weathered face, a shadow crossing it that had nothing to do with the passing of a cloud overhead. "There was a deal of unhappiness in this house back then that folk don't much speak of now. His lordship had a daughter, you understand, not by her ladyship his wife, God rest her, but by another woman entirely, some years before his marriage. He brought the child here to be raised quiet-like, under another name, calling her a ward or some such, though everyone below stairs knew well enough what she truly was, and most of us came to love her for it, if I'm honest. Sweet little thing she was. Grew up gentle and clever, and his lordship doted on her something terrible, more than was wise, perhaps, given what she was to become of it all." Miss Marple sat very still upon the low stone wall, her hands folded quietly in her lap, and asked, in a voice carefully pitched to carry no more weight than idle curiosity, what had become of her. Tomkins's face closed, briefly, in the particular manner of a man approaching a memory he has spent many years agreeing, silently and by long habit, not to speak of. "Sent away," he said at last, sudden-like, no warning to any of us below stairs, though there was talk enough after. Some said his lordship's health had failed him, and Lady Constance, newly married into the house by then, would not abide the girl's presence a moment longer than she had to. Others said worse things, that I'll not repeat, about what might have passed between his lordship and the girl that oughtn't to have, though I never believed a word of it myself. She were like a daughter to him, plain as day, and nothing more sinister than that. Whatever the truth of it, she was gone inside a week, with nothing but a small sum of money and a warning, I heard, never to trouble the family again. 19 years old she was, and turned out of the only home she'd ever known, as though she'd never belonged to it at all. He shook his head slowly, the soil still turning between his weathered fingers. I never saw her again, nor heard her name spoken in this house from that day to this. Leastways, not until you've gone and asked me of it now, and I don't rightly know why an old woman visiting for the funeral tea should care to know it. Miss Marple did not answer him directly, for she was no longer entirely certain, in that moment, that she trusted her own voice to remain as placid and unremarkable as the question required. Instead, she asked, with careful gentleness, whether Tomkins recalled the name by which the girl had been known in the household. The old gardener frowned, reaching back across 4 decades, with the visible effort of a man dredging something long submerged. "Helena," he said at last, slowly, as though tasting the shape of a word he had not allowed himself to speak in a very long time. "Miss Helena, we called her, though I never rightly knew if that were her Christian name entire, or something shorter besides. And her surname," he shook his head, "that I never knew at all. His lordship's man always called her simply Miss Helena, and that were the whole of it, so far as any of us below stairs ever learned." Miss Marple thanked him, with genuine and quiet warmth, for his kindness in speaking with her, and remained upon the low stone wall a good while after he had returned, stiffly and without further conversation, to his work among the damasks, for she found she was no longer entirely capable of rising just yet. So occupied was her mind with the small, precise arithmetic now assembling itself before her, unbidden and entirely undeniable, out of 30 years of scattered fragments. A girl named Helena, sent away at 19 with a small sum of money and a warning never to return. A photograph, taken that same summer, of a young woman captioned under a name that was not her own. A companion who had arrived in this house some 8 years past, and had never once, in all that time, spoken of her own history before it. And a chin, lifted at a particular angle against some private and long-carried weight, that Miss Marple had now seen, quite unmistakably, upon 2 faces separated by 30 years and a single, deliberately altered name. She sat very still among the roses, the autumn sun moving slowly across the old stone wall beneath her, and understood, with the quiet, terrible clarity of a woman who has spent a lifetime learning to trust exactly this sort of understanding, that the girl sent away from Ashworth Manor 30 years ago, and the woman who had poured Lady Constance's tea every Thursday for the past 8 years, were not 2 women at all, but one and the same, and that whatever had happened in that drawing-room 3 days past had not begun there, but had been 30 long years in the making, in a house that had taught one small, gentle girl, with terrible and lasting precision, exactly what it felt like to be erased. Chapter 8. The annuity Inspector Craddock's certainty, so briskly and confidently displayed a week before, had by the following Tuesday begun to show its first hairline cracks. Cracks that widened over the course of a single grey afternoon into something considerably more troubling to a man who prided himself on the tidiness of his conclusions. A moneylender's clerk, tracked down at last in London, produced a ledger confirming that Gerald Ashworth had, in fact, settled the whole of his most pressing debt some 4 days before Lady Constance's death, through the sale of a small parcel of shares he had inherited from his mother, a transaction so mundane, so entirely lacking in desperation, that it rendered the urgent, threatening letter found among his papers not evidence of a man driven to murder, but the harmless remnant of an anxiety already resolved. Craddock, informed of this development by telephone, was heard by his constable to use language rather stronger than his usual professional restraint permitted, and Miss Marple, learning of it that evening from Mrs. Featherstone, who had heard it from the constable's wife, received the news with the quiet, unsurprised satisfaction of a woman whose private arithmetic had already told her, some days before, precisely what shape the truth would eventually take. But it was not triumph, she felt, walking the lane toward Ashworth Manor the following morning with a small basket of Mrs. Featherstone's early chrysanthemums as her ostensible reason for calling, and a rather heavier certainty carried, unspoken, beneath it. It was something closer to dread, the particular, familiar dread of a woman who has solved a puzzle only to find that its solution carries a grief far larger than the puzzle itself, and who must now, with whatever gentleness she can summon, go and confirm it face to face. She found Eleanor in the small morning room that had, in the week since Lady Constance's death, become her particular refuge, seated by the window with a piece of mending untouched in her lap, her face turned toward the garden with an expression of such careful, composed stillness that Miss Marple, pausing in the doorway, thought again of that single unguarded moment a week before, the shoulders settling into a doorframe, as though returning, after long exile, to something once entirely her own. "I hope you won't mind an old woman's company for a few moments," Miss Marple said, settling herself into the chair opposite, with the placid, unhurried manner she had perfected across a lifetime of such visits. "I found myself thinking of you, my dear, and thought I would bring these along, though I dare say the house has flowers enough of its own." Eleanor's thanks were correct and quiet, and entirely without warmth, and for some minutes the conversation moved along the safe, shallow channels such visits customarily observed: the weather, the wearying business of the inquest, the small kindnesses of neighbours during a difficult week. But Miss Marple, watching Eleanor's hands as they moved, with careful precision, to arrange the chrysanthemums in a vase upon the window-sill, found herself thinking of the burnt letter fragment still folded in her own bureau drawer, of the old will naming Eleanor for nothing at all, of a girl called Helena, sent away 30 years before with a small sum of money and a warning never to return, and understood with the particular sorrowful clarity of a woman who has decided there is no longer any kindness in delay, that the time for shallow channels had passed. "Tell me, my dear," she said gently, watching Eleanor's face with the close, careful attention she had given it across every previous meeting. "Were you very close to your own father? I find myself wondering, at my age, what became of everyone's people. One grows so curious about where we all come from, in the end." It was a small question, offered in the mild, wandering manner of an old woman's idle conversation, and it should, by every ordinary measure, have passed as harmlessly as the questions that had come before it. But Eleanor's hands, arranging the last chrysanthemum in its vase, went suddenly and entirely still, and when she turned from the window, her face had lost, for the first time in Miss Marple's acquaintance with her, every trace of its careful composure, replaced by something raw and unguarded, and very nearly unbearable to witness, as though a door long and deliberately held shut had, at that single word, swung open before she had found time to brace herself against it. "My father," Eleanor repeated, and her voice, when it came, carried none of its usual precise, practiced neutrality, but something cracked and low, as though the word itself cost her a great effort to speak aloud. "I hardly remember him at all, Miss Marple. I was very young when I lost him." She turned back toward the window, her hands gripping the edge of the sill with a sudden, visible tightness, and for a long moment said nothing further, while the ordinary sounds of the garden drifted in through the glass. A blackbird, somewhere among the roses, and the distant, rhythmic scrape of Tompkins's spade against the earth. Miss Marple did not press her. She had learned, across a great many such silences, that the truest confessions arrive not when they are demanded, but when they are simply, patiently allowed room enough to come. And so she sat quietly, her own hands folded in her lap, and waited, while Eleanor's shoulders, rigid at first, gradually loosened into something closer to exhaustion, the exhaustion of a woman who has carried a weight so long and so carefully that the simple act of setting it down, even for a moment, leaves her almost too tired to stand. "He was very kind to me," Eleanor said at last, so quietly that Miss Marple had to lean forward slightly to catch the words at all. "Kinder than I had any right to expect, given—" She stopped herself, and Miss Marple watched her visibly gather the scattered pieces of her composure back around herself, like a woman drawing a coat closed against sudden cold. "Given the ordinary circumstances of an orphan's upbringing," she finished, in a voice that had recovered most, though not quite all, of its earlier careful neutrality. "Forgive me, Miss Marple. It has been a difficult week, and I find myself rather more sentimental than usual." "There is nothing to forgive, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, and meant it entirely, for she had seen, in that brief, unguarded moment, quite enough to confirm what 30 years of scattered fragments had already told her, and felt no need, not yet, to press the wound any further open than grief and a single careless word had already made it. But as she rose, a little while later, to take her leave, murmuring something about not wishing to tire her further, and pressing Eleanor's hand in farewell with genuine, sorrowful warmth, she noticed, in the moment their hands met, that Eleanor's fingers, cool and composed as they had been throughout the whole of their careful, guarded conversation, were trembling now, very slightly, and entirely beyond her power to still them. Miss Marple walked home along the lane that afternoon with the small, quiet chrysanthemum basket empty upon her arm, and understood, with a certainty that brought her no satisfaction at all, that she now knew not merely who had poisoned Lady Constance Ashworth's tea, but precisely why, and that the knowing of it, far from resolving the sorrow that had settled over her since the moment she first saw a lifted chin in a 30-year-old photograph, had only deepened it into something she suspected she would carry home with her, quite unresolved, long after this particular mystery had been laid formally to rest. Chapter 9. The Master's Chair. It was Miss Marple herself, in the end, who requested that the household be gathered once more in the drawing-room where Lady Constance had died. A request delivered to Inspector Craddock with such quiet, unassuming courtesy that he found himself agreeing to it before he had properly considered how unusual it was to be led, in his own investigation, by an elderly lady's mild suggestion rather than his own procedural instinct. He had grown, over the preceding days, rather more willing to listen to her than his earlier briskness might have suggested, for a man whose confident case against Gerald Ashworth has crumbled to nothing beneath him develops, of necessity, a certain humility regarding his own certainties, and Craddock, to his credit, possessed enough sense to recognize when the ground beneath his convictions had shifted. The drawing-room, when they assembled there on that quiet Thursday afternoon, precisely 1 week after the murder, had been restored to something very near its former order. The Persian rug cleaned of its stain, the tea-things replaced, the whole room arranged once more into the particular, ritualized elegance that Lady Constance had maintained across so many identical Thursdays. It was, Miss Marple thought, taking her own seat near the window with the same placid composure she had shown a week before. A curious and rather unsettling thing to sit once more in a room so carefully restored to innocence, as though the house itself, in its silent, dutiful way, had already begun the work of forgetting. Gerald sat near the fireplace, pale and subdued, the recent day's ordeal having stripped away a good deal of his earlier restlessness and left something quieter and more genuinely shaken in its place. Dr. Pell stood near the window with his hands folded behind his back, his professional composure fully restored, though Miss Marple noted he still would not quite look toward the chair where Lady Constance had died. Vera Latimer sat rigidly upright beside her husband, who had been persuaded, this time, to accompany her, and whose steady, watchful presence beside her seemed to have restored, at least outwardly, some measure of her earlier composure. And Eleanor stood near the tea-table, exactly as she had stood a week before, her hands folded, her face arranged into its familiar, careful neutrality, though Miss Marple, watching her closely across the width of the room, thought she detected, beneath that careful stillness, something taut and watchful, like an animal that has heard, somewhere in the distance, the first faint sound of an approaching storm. "I have asked the inspector's kind permission," Miss Marple began, once the room had settled into its uneasy quiet, "to walk us all once more through the particulars of that dreadful afternoon. Not, I hope you will believe me, from any wish to cause further distress, but because I have found, across a great many years of observing such things, that the truth very often reveals itself not in what people say, but in the small, unconsidered habits of how they move through a room they have known a very long time." She paused, folding her hands with the mild, unhurried manner of a woman embarking upon nothing more alarming than a pleasant reminiscence. "Perhaps we might simply recall, together, exactly how that Thursday unfolded. where everyone sat and stood and moved from the moment the tea was brought in. It was Craddock, prompted by a glance from Miss Marple, who guided the room through the reconstruction that followed, directing Gerald back to his chair by the fireplace, Dr. Pell to his place near the window, Vera Latimer to the low settee she had occupied the week before, and the household, hesitant at first, gradually fell into the rhythm of the exercise, with the particular, uncanny ease of people reenacting a ritual their bodies remembered rather better than their conscious minds wished to admit. "And the tea itself," Miss Marple said, when the room had settled into its remembered arrangement, "was poured, I understand, exactly as it always was." "Exactly as always," Eleanor said, moving to the tea table with the same precise, practiced grace Miss Marple had watched a week before, lifting the pot and beginning, almost without conscious thought, to demonstrate the pouring of 6 cups in the same careful order she had followed every Thursday for 8 quiet years. Gerald's cup first, then Dr. Pell's, then Vera Latimer's, moving around the table with the fluent, unhesitating rhythm of long habit, until she reached, at last, the place where Lady Constance had always sat. It was there, in the small silence that followed, that Craddock, mindful of his instructions, though not entirely certain what purpose they served, asked, gently enough, whether anyone else had ever occupied that particular chair in all the years the household had gathered there for tea. "Never," Eleanor said, and there was something in the flat, immediate certainty of her answer that seemed to surprise even herself, as though the word had escaped before she had properly weighed it. That chair was always her ladyship's alone. No one else ever sat in it. And then gesturing, quite unconsciously, quite without apparent thought, in the small automatic manner of someone completing a sentence her body had begun before her mind had caught up to it, toward an old high-backed armchair standing somewhat apart from the tea table, near the far wall, its dark leather worn soft with age, its position in the room clearly established, but, Miss Marple had noted upon her very first visit to this drawing-room, entirely unused, gathering the faint, undisturbed dust of long disuse. Except, of course, for his chair. No one ever sits in his chair either. It has always simply stood there, exactly as it is. The room went very still. Miss Marple watched the small, ordinary silence stretch and deepen around that single, unremarkable sentence, watched Craddock's brow furrow in the particular manner of a man sensing significance in something he cannot yet properly name, watched Dr. Pell's eyes move, slowly and with dawning unease, from the old armchair to Eleanor's face and back again, and watched, above all, the moment when Eleanor herself, standing quite still with the teapot yet in her hand, seemed to hear, for the first time, the full weight of what she had just said, and understood, with visible and devastating clarity, exactly what it had revealed. For Lord Ashworth had died some 30 years before Eleanor Prynne had ever, by the household's own careful and consistent account, first entered this house, and no mere companion, arriving fresh to service 8 years past, engaged and paid and instructed in every particular of a stranger's household, could possibly have known, without being told, and without ever once having been told, that this particular chair, standing silent and unused against the far wall, had once belonged to a man 3 decades dead. It was not a fact one learned in the ordinary course of service. It was a fact one carried, quietly, involuntarily, across 30 years of careful forgetting, because one had known, once, precisely who had sat in it, and precisely what it had felt like to watch him sit there. Eleanor set the teapot down upon the table with great and deliberate care, as though it were the last ordinary act she trusted her own hands to perform correctly, and turned to face the room, her composure at last and entirely gone, and rose to her full, quiet height with the particular, terrible dignity of a woman who has carried a secret so long and so completely that its ending, when it finally arrives, comes almost as a mercy. Chapter 10. Afternoon tea, one last time. No one in the drawing-room moved. Even Craddock, whose instinct in any ordinary circumstance would have been to step forward, to caution, to begin the formal machinery of arrest, seemed to sense that this particular silence belonged, for the moment, to Miss Marple alone, and that to break it too soon would be to lose something the room might never fully recover. The truth, offered freely, rather than dragged forth by force. "Helena," Miss Marple said, very gently, into that stillness, and the name fell into the quiet room with the soft, irrevocable weight of a stone dropped into still water. "I believe that was your name, once, before you became Miss Eleanor Prynne." Eleanor, Helena, did not deny it. She stood very straight beside the tea-table, her hands now perfectly still at her sides, and something in her bearing seemed, at last, to settle into a kind of terrible relief, as though she had spent so many years holding a single, careful posture that the abandoning of it came almost as a physical ease, however devastating its consequences. "Yes," she said, quite simply. "That was my name. I had almost forgotten the sound of it myself, Miss Marple. It has been a very long time since anyone spoke it to me." "You were Lord Ashworth's daughter," Miss Marple continued, quietly, watching the woman before her with an expression that held nothing of triumph and a great deal of sorrow. "Raised in this house, and loved in it, by all the accounts I have been able to gather, until Lady Constance came into the family, and you were sent away, at 19, with a small sum of money and an instruction never to return." "Sent away!" Helena's voice, when she repeated the words, carried a faint, bitter precision, as though she had turned them over so many times across 30 years that they had worn smooth and hard as river stones. "That is a very gentle way of putting it, Miss Marple, though I don't fault you for it. I dare say it is the way such things are always put, afterward, by people who were not in the room when it happened." She looked, briefly, toward the window, toward the garden beyond it, gold now with the same low afternoon light that had fallen across this room a week before. "I was told, quite plainly, that I had never truly belonged in this house at all, that whatever affection my father had shown me was a weakness in him and an embarrassment to the family, and that the kindest thing I could do for everyone concerned was to disappear as completely as though I had never existed. I was given money enough to manage for a year or two, and a warning that if I ever attempted to return, or to claim any connection to this family, I should regret it very bitterly indeed." She paused. "I was 19 years old. I had never lived anywhere but this house. I did not know, that first night in a rented room in London, how one was even meant to begin existing when one has been told, quite carefully and quite deliberately, that one's existence was a mistake. And yet you did exist, Miss Marple said gently, for 30 years. I did, Helena agreed, and something in her voice, for the first time, trembled very slightly. I built a small, quiet life abroad, a governess's post here, a companion's position there, always careful, always watchful, always ready to disappear again if the past came too close to catching me. I told myself, for a very long time, that I had made my peace with it, that I did not think of this house, or of my father, more than any ordinary person thinks of a childhood long since lost to them. She shook her head slowly. But one does not make peace with erasure, Miss Marple. One simply learns to carry it more quietly. And then, Miss Marple said, you came back. I came back. Helena's gaze moved, for a moment, to the old armchair standing silent against the far wall, and something in her face, looking at it, was unbearably tender. My father had died some years before. I read of it in a newspaper, in a city 300 miles from here, and I wept for a man I had not been permitted to see in over a decade, and told myself that was the end of it, that whatever claim I had once had on this place had died with him. But grief is a strange thing, Miss Marple. It does not always behave as one expects, and 8 years ago, quite without deciding to, I found myself on the train to Little Wyvern, telling myself I only wished to see the house once more, from a safe distance, before I grew too old to make the journey at all. But you did not stay at a safe distance, Miss Marple observed quietly. No, Helena's mouth curved, briefly, into something that was not quite a smile. I saw an advertisement in the local paper for a lady's companion, and I told myself, foolishly, I see now, though it did not feel foolish at the time, that there could be no harm in simply applying, that I would use a different name as I had used different names before, and that if I were engaged, it would only be for a season or two, only long enough to walk once more through the rooms I had loved as a child, before I disappeared again, as quietly as I had come. She looked, for a long moment, at her own hands. I did not expect Lady Constance to recognize me. I had changed a great deal in 30 years, and she had only known me, after all, for the brief span of her early marriage into this family. But she did recognize me, Miss Marple, almost at once, I think, though she said nothing of it for nearly a month, only watching me with a particular, knowing coldness that I could not, at first, account for. And when she did speak of it, Miss Marple asked, what did she say? Helena's composure, so carefully maintained through the whole of her confession thus far, wavered at last, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. She told me she knew exactly who I was, and that she would allow me to stay, as her companion, in her employ, under my false name, provided I never once acknowledged, to her or to anyone, who I had truly been, or what I had truly lost. She told me it amused her, rather, to have Lord Ashworth's own daughter serving her tea each afternoon, entirely unrecognized by anyone in the village, entirely at her mercy, entirely dependent on her continued discretion for the roof over my head. A single tear traced its way down Helena's composed, weathered face, and she did not move to wipe it away. For 8 years, Miss Marple, I lived in my father's house, poured tea in the room where he once held me as a child, and was made to understand, in 100 small and careful cruelties, that I existed there only on sufferance, that my presence was tolerated, not because Lady Constance felt any obligation toward me, but because my humiliation gave her a particular, private satisfaction that she was not willing to relinquish. "And the will," Miss Marple said, very gently. "You knew, I think, what the old will said, that you were named for nothing at all." "I had long since stopped hoping for anything from that quarter," Helena said. "I had made my peace, or told myself I had, with the thought that I would serve out my years here, as I had served the 8 before them, and ask for nothing beyond my wages, and whatever small dignity I could preserve for myself in the privacy of my own room." She paused, and her hands, Miss Marple noticed, had begun, very slightly, to tremble again. But then, 3 weeks ago, Lady Constance informed me, quite casually, over the arranging of that week's flowers, as though she were remarking upon the weather, that she intended to leave me a small annuity in her new will. "For services rendered," she called it. She seemed to find it rather amusing, that particular phrase. She told me she thought it only fitting, after so many years of my, and here she used the word quite deliberately, Miss Marple, my usefulness to her. Helena's voice cracked, at last, entirely. 8 years, and 30 more before that, a whole life spent loving a house that had cast me out of it, and grieving a father I was forbidden to mourn openly, and all she could offer me, at the very end, was payment for having been useful. As though I were a piece of furniture to be accounted for in her will, as though I had never been her husband's own daughter at all, but only ever the woman who poured her tea. "And it was then," Miss Marple said, very quietly, "that you wrote the letter." "I wrote it, and I burned it," Helena said. "I could not bring myself to send it. What would have been the use? She would only have laughed, or worse, dismissed me before I had anywhere else to go. So I burned it, and told myself I would say nothing, and endure the annuity as I had endured everything else, with whatever composure I had left." She looked up, then, and met Miss Marple's eyes directly, for the first time in their entire acquaintance, with an expression stripped entirely of its careful neutrality, raw and exhausted, and very nearly relieved. "But something in me had already broken, Miss Marple, though I did not fully understand it myself until the moment the tea was poured that Thursday, and I found myself measuring the poison into her cup with hands that felt, quite strangely, as though they belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had simply grown tired, after 30 years, of being told she did not exist. The room remained very still. Craddock, at last, stepped forward, gently, and without triumph, for even he, Miss Marple thought, watching him, had been moved beyond his usual professional distance by the quiet, terrible dignity of the confession he had just witnessed, and spoke the necessary words, the formal words, that would carry Helena Ashworth, who had lived 30 years as Eleanor Prynne, out of this house and into whatever reckoning the law required of her. She did not resist, and did not weep further, but turned, before she was led away, to look once more at the old armchair standing silent against the far wall, her father's chair, unused for 30 years, and asked, in a voice so quiet that only Miss Marple, standing nearest, fully caught the words, "Do you think, Miss Marple, that anyone would have believed me if I had simply come to the door 8 years ago and told the truth of who I was?" Miss Marple considered the question with the full seriousness it deserved, for she did not believe in offering comfortable lies, even at moments when a comfortable lie might have seemed the kinder thing. "I think," she said slowly, "that Lady Constance would not have believed you, my dear. Or rather, that she would have believed you perfectly well and simply denied it regardless, for it would have cost her a great deal to acknowledge what she had done to you 30 years before. As for the rest of the village," she paused, "I think perhaps some of us might have believed you, in time, had you given us the chance. But I understand, better than you might imagine, why the chance felt too great a risk to take, after everything this house had already taken from you." Helena held her gaze a moment longer, and something passed between them that was not quite forgiveness, and not quite absolution, but was perhaps the nearest thing to being truly seen that she had been offered in 30 long years. And then she was gone, led quietly out through the hall and into the ordinary grey afternoon beyond, while the household she had served so faithfully and so bitterly stood in silence around the ruins of a story that had taken 3 decades and 1 poisoned cup of tea to finally be told. Miss Marple remained in the drawing room a little while after the others had dispersed, seated once more in her window seat, and asked the young maid, Polly, if she might trouble her for a fresh pot of tea, for there is, she had always found, a particular usefulness in the small, ordinary rituals of life, especially in the aftermath of things too large and too sorrowful to be fully absorbed all at once. She sat quietly with her cup, watching the last of the afternoon light move gold and slow across the Persian rug, and thought of all the small cruelties, ordinary and unremarked, that pass daily between people who consider themselves perfectly respectable, the quiet withholding of love, the careful cultivation of another's shame, the long, patient erosion of a person's sense of their own right to exist, and understood, with the particular sorrow of a woman who had spent a lifetime observing human nature in villages very much like this one, that murder is very rarely born of wickedness alone. More often, she thought, it is born of ordinary unkindness, repeated and repeated across many quiet years, until something in even the gentlest heart finally, terribly, breaks. There would be no triumph in this case, she knew, when she related it, as she inevitably would, to her nephew Raymond or to Dolly Bantry over tea in St. Mary Mead. Only the particular, weary satisfaction of a puzzle correctly solved, and a much larger, much sadder truth left standing, unresolved, in its place. Justice, she reflected, finishing her tea as the light outside faded gently toward evening, is a fine and necessary thing, and she did not doubt that Helena Ashworth would answer, in the proper course of law, for what she had done. But justice, Miss Marple thought, gathering her things at last and rising to make her way home through the darkening lane, is not the same thing as mercy, and a society that had spent 30 years teaching one gentle, grieving woman that she did not deserve the second could hardly claim much surprise, nor much innocence, when it finally received, at long last, the bitter fruits of the first. She walked home to Mrs. Featherstone's cottage beneath a sky gone soft and violet with the coming night, and thought, as she often did at the close of such matters, that the truest mysteries were never really about who held the poison, but about who, long before any poison was ever measured, had first taught another human being that they did not matter, and that this, in the end, was a mystery no inspector's notebook, however thorough, would ever quite manage to solve.